I refused to take my 9-year-old stepson on vacation over this. My husband and I have been married for about 5 years now. Before we met, we were both in previous marriages. For context, I will be giving a background to our previous marriages to help with your understanding of what exactly happened. I had been married to Dave for about 8 years before our marriage came crashing down. Dave and I met during our days at the university. We both stayed within the same neighborhood, but none of us spoke to the other. But the university was able to link the both of us. Dave was studying computer engineering at the time we started talking, while I studied comparative literature. The day we began talking happened out of sheer coincidence. I was in the library on a Friday because I had about 3 novels to read in preparation for lectures on Monday. One thing about me was that I loved to prepare beforehand when I could. I hated being called upon by the lecturer or teacher and began to stare like the Statue of Liberty. The professor who took the course was also a very difficult woman. You had to please her by asking and answering questions in class. True, she wasn't so strict with her marking, but once she knew you from class, she became more lenient. Because I knew I had to do incredibly well in my first degree, I began working on how to please the professor. So I was in the library and was completely immersed in the book. Honestly, I forgot all about what time it was. The novel I read was so interesting. I was no longer conscious of my environment. If I were, I would have realized that it was getting late already, and I risked staying at a friend's. My roommate, Melanie, was one heavy sleeper, and her bedtime was 9. If I wasn't back in the room before then, there was no point trying to reach her through her phone. The first time I had this not-so-nice experience with my roommate, I had gone for a night reading with a group. We ended at exactly 9, and I got to the room before 10. The door was locked, but I didn't know this was going to be a big problem. I tried Melanie, but it would not go through. I knocked on the door, but I still couldn't hear the sound of a living person in the room. Eventually, I phoned a friend and asked whether I could stay overnight. The next day, I told Melanie what had happened, and she appeared so clueless. Nevertheless, she apologized and told me that she was one heavy sleeper and that it would be better for me to get back from wherever I went before she take a nap. Back to that night, I didn't realize it was past 9 until I felt a very gentle tap on my skin. I hated being disturbed while reading and wanted to find out who this offender was. However, when I turned, I found the most handsome guy the first had ever seen on campus smiling genuinely at me. It took me a few seconds to understand that he was saying something to me. I could not hear him because my ears were blocked. I immediately unplugged them and introduced myself. He told me his name and said he was usually the last person in the library, but was surprised that someone had broken his record. It was then reality dawned on me. I checked my time and saw that it was past 10 already. I started to panic because I didn't know what to do. At that time, there was no point in trying to reach Melanie. My brain began to think of things that I could do. Dave noticed that I was worried and asked what was wrong. I vaguely and briefly explained the situation. He chuckled and told me he had a reservation in a hotel close by and he wasn't going to stay there because he had an apartment. I accepted the offer, and that marked the beginning of what would lead to our marriage. I continued to see Dave in the library, and sometimes we would take breaks to talk. We got to know things about each other. It was somewhere in our discussion that Dave revealed to me that we both stayed in the same neighborhood. He even knew my house and things about me, like the high school I attended. His mom and mine were good friends, too. I told Melanie about Dave, and she liked him from the outside. We began dating officially after going on dates, pretending like we didn't both know that we had feelings for each other. When he asked me to be his girlfriend, I didn't think about it twice. I told him yes, and we started our relationship. After we both graduated school, the feelings we had for each other seemed to have heightened. There was nothing I didn't know about Dave, and it was the same on his end. When I told my mom about him, she told me that she remembered his mom. My mom immediately validated our marriage, although I hadn't wanted to settle down. Then, about 5 years after dating, we finally decided to get married. Dave and I worked at different places and got enough income that if one of us was not working, we wouldn't run out of money. I thought that our marriage would be better than our years of dating. For one, we were no longer strangers, and I felt that if there was any issue, it would be settled instantly. But I was wrong. Barely months into our marriage, Dave and I began to have issues. These were things that shouldn't normally cause any form of disagreement, but Dave would prolong things. I noticed that he was beginning to change. He always appeared impatient, and sometimes I would catch him staring at me as though he wanted to throw me off a bridge or something. Later that year, I discovered that Dave had a son from another woman, of which he didn't inform me. To say this news broke me would be an understatement. I got the information from Melanie and wished it were false, but the evidence was glaring. After much consideration, I decided to ask him about it. He didn't seem apologetic. What he said was that it was a mistake that happened while he was a teenager, and it wouldn't be bad having a kid in our midst since I didn't have one yet. This pained me so much, but because I loved Dave, I decided to try and put up with Dave's child. However, it was not an easy thing, especially because Dre didn't allow us some alone time. He was always interfering in whatever thing we did. This got me angry, and I didn't think I could continue to endure this. I had told Dave about this countless times, but he never took me seriously. After the second year, and I noticed that nothing had changed, I decided that it was best if Dave and I went our separate ways. I mean, what was the essence of being in a marriage if the couple didn't have enough time for themselves? I didn't tell Dave about my decision. Instead, I went with it and handed him the paper for his signature. He didn't question me. It almost seemed, in fact, that he had been waiting to get this divorce. The period we got the divorce was not as bad as I had imagined. I thought I would bawl out my eyes, but that didn't happen. Instead, I found more time to focus on work and other things that I hadn't been paying attention to all the while. I blocked off Dave completely from my life and changed my city of residence. Thankfully, I earned well and was able to do this without the help of anyone. It was in this city that I met Frank. Frank and I first met at the cafeteria. I always stopped by each evening after a hectic day at work. My memory isn't so clear, but I think what made us speak to each other for the first time was the news. We had both been watching the news, but a controversial topic raised a debate. We exchanged contact information at the cafeteria and promised to each other, but none of us would text until some months later. When Frank did text me, eventually, it was as if we had known each other for so many years. He explained that he had lost my number, but got it back much later. I immediately liked the vibe Frank gave off. He was a jovial person, and he told the silliest jokes. His level of puns was also something else. Frank could attempt to twist everything and anything you said. I always looked forward to a conversation with him because of this. On bad days, he knew the exact things to say to make me smile. Not even Dave could do this. While we were still married, I cannot remember when exactly we moved past the talking stage, but I do know that we went on a couple of dates. Frank preferred quiet places, so we would usually go to really expensive restaurants where one could be sure that not so many people would frequent. I got to know a lot about him during our dating period. He told me that he had been married before, but they got divorced. I told him that it was the same with me. I then went on to explain how my ex-husband's son came into the picture and made the marriage feel stifling. Frank told me that he had a son as well, but that his step-wife and he got divorced because she wanted a fresh start. He said he had to take custody of their child even though he wanted shared custody because his ex was not willing to do so. I wondered whether this would be a problem if our relationship led to marriage. As if he could read my thoughts, he assured me that it wouldn't be an issue because his son stays with his mom and only visits him periodically. Frank and I got married the next year. I didn't need any more signs that he was a good match for me. Because of Frank's background, a lot of money was spent on the wedding planning in preparation. His mom wanted an elaborate wedding because her son was getting married to the most beautiful woman in the world, and she wanted everyone to know that. We barely spent a dime during the wedding planning. Both our parents took care of everything and kept assuring us that it was nothing. I believed them that it was nothing because they had the money. While I was planning for our wedding, I took the time to get to know my stepson. He was 8 at the time, and he looked exactly like Frank. He had cute dimples on both sides of his cheeks, and his dentition was just the same as Frank's. He had a long afro, and Frank mentioned that he got it from his mom. It had something to do with the fact that she was of African descent. Simon was the name of my stepson. He didn't seem so friendly to me on the first day we met. I introduced myself to him and asked what his name was. I knew his name, but wanted to start a discourse between us. Simon stared into my eyes for some seconds, then brought out his iPad as if he hadn't heard me in the first place. I took this as him being uncomfortable talking to me. His dad wasn't around to tell him I posed no threat to him, so I let that slide. But that was only the first of many other encounters. I had the strong conviction that Simon had something against me. Perhaps it was what his mom told him, or something else. I could not exactly wrap my fingers around it. Amazing thing was that when his dad was around, he responded well to me. But the moment he left, he became his usual self. I didn't tell my husband any of these because I thought it was not a serious issue. By the second year, I gave birth to our first child, Chelsea. 3 years later, we had our son Andrew. Since I got my kids, I didn't have the same time I had before in trying to make Simon like me. Caring for Chelsea and Andrew was quite a handful for me. Chelsea was quite picky. She had so many things she didn't eat. Analogies. The implication was that I had to always prepare her meals separately. Andrew, on the other hand, was quite a happy and playful baby. He would crawl around the house, scattering his toys all over. Whoever said being a mother was an easy thing? Even though I didn't seem to notice Simon because of my kids, whenever we had an outing, I would always push it to my husband that he included him. I knew that if we didn't do this, he might end up feeling secluded and not loved. Whenever I got things for my kids, I also got some for him as well. I hoped that somewhere he would learn to accept me, but nothing seemed to be working. The first time Simon spoke to me, the kind of harsh words he uttered broke me. He told me that I was the one responsible for their parents getting separated, and that I had intentionally snatched his dad from his mom. I watched him speak, but said nothing. When he was done, I went to my room and tried to distract myself by watching some videos. I made a mental note to tell his dad, but then I didn't. Wanna be the cause of a fight between father and son? So I kept it to myself. Fast forward to about 6 months after the incident. I was able to work fully because we had been able to get a reliable babysitter for Andrew and Chelsea. Barely 2 months into work, I got a bonus. It was more than anything I expected. What better way to enjoy the bonus than go on a family vacation? This time, I didn't make plans for Simon, because since he came into my life, he had been nothing more than a pain in the neck. I wanted to enjoy the vacation without getting those hard stares from him. He could stay with his stepmom while we went on vacation. I told my mom all about it, how Simon had never liked me from the outset. I also told her of my plans to go on a family vacation without him because I wanted only happy memories. She saw my viewpoint as reasonable, and she agreed with it. I didn't think that my husband would have any issues with it. This was because I was usually the one advocating for Simon and making sure he was included in whatever plans we had. So if I told him this time that I wanted just us, he would understand. However, when I told him of my plans for the family vacation, he said I was being unfair and unnecessarily marginalizing his son because he was a stepson to me. He explained that because Simon didn't have a mother figure in his life should make me even more involved in his life. He also said that all the while I was being a hypocrite because I hadn't truly accepted his son into the family. I listened to him accuse me in different ways and waited until he was done to explain why I had chosen that line of action. When he was done, I told him that there was something he needed to know, but before then I requested that Simon be present. Simon was brought to the house in no time, and I began. I told Frank that Simon was not exactly the person he imagined him to be. Since I began speaking to him, he had been nothing but mean and rude to me. I told Frank about the day he spoke to me about being the cause of his parents' divorce. He also accused me of snatching my husband away from his mom. While my husband listened to me, I could see how shocked he was by the information I shared with him. The reason I wanted Simon present was to see whether he would try to refute anything I said. He didn't. He only stared down at his shoes. When I was done, my husband turned to Simon and asked how I had offended him. I had never seen my husband that angry for all the time I had stayed with him. Simon said he only thought that I was the reason he left. My husband told him that in fact, his mom had left him because she wanted a fresh start and he was an obstruction. Hearing this, Simon went on his knees and broke into tears. He asked me to forgive him for muddling things up and for how he had treated me when all I wanted was to make him feel loved. I told him to wipe his eyes and get up. I never had an issue with him in the first place. I only didn't want him on the vacation because I wanted good memories. Simon promised to always treat me with respect. With that, I extended my arms and gave him a hug for the first time in many years. It was a happy time for everyone in the room. Simon hugged both Andrew and Chelsea and promised to be a good older brother to them. Of course, Simon is now going with us on vacation, and I honestly look forward to having a wonderful time with my family.